theme song for the book lunch, and here we are. Journey of an Aesthete podcast. We're going to commence today with Volume 2 of Hannah Arendt's Life of the Mind. And I'm going to sit in my chair here and organize my items and books. So we've let's to get up to speed, as they sometimes say. We're going to commence today with willing. Now, the entire text or book is in 2 volumes, and there's written at the end of her life. And of course, the first volume is Thinking. We're doing willing today, which should be most interesting. There's a lot to discuss about that. It's a concept, willing, and an activity, which is, I should say before we even talk more about this book, for, I would say, many 100,000 years, and actually today as we speak right now, the most contentious in philosophy. It's among those topics that there's profound disagreement, but even when there's disagreement on a subject like will or freedom, oftentimes, because we live in an era, we live, all of us, whether we like it or not, depending on where we find ourselves in an era, and eras usually, and this applies even when there's even in eras that are more hospitable to plurality or pluralism, that are kind of a little more tolerant, even those eras are dominated by an often essential viewpoint. And a lot of the text of the Volume 2 is Hannah Arendt, I would say, negotiating, reacting to, thinking with, and thinking through what was dominant in 1972, 71, 72, 73, 74, those years. And so we're going to have to talk a little bit about that. Procedure I'm going to use is what I always use for every show I do, whether we're talking about a piece of music or talking about a movie, as we did like Edward's Wonderful 10 most recently. Close reading. So, of course, we're not going to cover every single paragraph, every sentence of her text. We're going to edit in terms of what we discuss. But what we do discuss, we're going to apply the close reading method in which I was trained, and now passing it on to all of you folks here. So I think we're going to get out the book, make sure I have the right book because they look like each other. Here we go, Willing, Volume 2. So we're gonna start with her text. Get out my glasses here. I may even take a drink of coffee if you don't mind. I don't know. I have a different pace, the world such as it is, right, often has a dominant pace, just like it has dominant ideas, whatever they may be. It also has a dominant lifestyle, dominant pace, and I beg the apologies of you folks. I'm a little bit slower in my pace and how I proceed. Maybe it goes along with the close reading, maybe not. Than what appears to me the dominant pace. I mean, I can talk fast. In some respects, I'm actually quite fast. That is some respects of life, but in this, I gotta go a little bit slow and ease into it. This book, Life of the Mind, is a extraordinary work, and I have to say also before we dig into her book that I have many positive emotions about it. I think it's I think it's a work of art to the degree to which works of nonfiction philosophy can be art, and they can, even though they may not be seen as such, even by their own authors sometimes, for example, if you have a really hyper-scientific kind of author in nonfiction who has a category, and in the category of art, they put in there Vermeer and Rembrandt and Schitt's Creek and, I don't know, plays by Chekhov or something. That's all in their kind of their art category, or Elizabeth Bishop poem, Mary Oliver poem. That's all art. And then this other category over here, we have sort of the hard scientific stuff. And actually, that's going to come up again in a few minutes. She's going to be dealing with that. So, not again. Everything's up high as it can be. I'm getting a comment here that the volume. How is that? Better? Is that better? I want to be able to be heard or not. Okay. It's I should talk a little. Let me interrupt. The book wants to discuss tech and technological change and living in a changed world, a world with AI. And I do the best I can. In other words, I'm not a tech maven. I'm as farthest from a tech maven as a human being can be and still be in the world and not living in a cave, and cooking over open fire and eliminating, doing bodily processes in an outhouse. In other words, putting that very extreme case aside, I'm in the contemporary world, and yet we're all different. And I'm not an engineer. I'm not an audio engineer. I've spent my life reading books like this and thinking about them very, very deeply, actually, some of which will be in evidence in this very episode. And there's only so many hours in the day, and I've also read all the stuff that forms her corpus background literature. That is Plato, Aristotle, Duns Scotus, Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, Nietzsche, which you'll get to today, Gilbert Ryle. I've read all these folks. And I don't know. I could be wrong about this, but I think if I spend time doing that and learning how to play the piano, I'm not spending a lot of time learning computer coding, and I'm not spending a lot of time throwing a football around. So, we all, it's just funny. So bear with me. I mean, I'm who I am, and we'll. Another thing we're going to do in this episode as we begin Willing is we're going to discuss her prose style of doing nonfiction philosophy in prose, as much as the actual ideas, pro or con, propositional, because it's important. And if I'm right, that Hannah Arendt is a great writer, and this is among her greatest texts. I think in some certain respects, it at least is equal to Origin of Totalitarianism, on violence, on revolution, the human condition between past and future, etc. We should talk about how she constructs sentences. We're not going to be grammarians. We're not going to be linguists necessarily, but we should pay so little attention to it. And so she starts, the second volume of Life of the Mind will be devoted to the faculty of the will. That's capitalized. Will. The W is capitalized. In keeping with her continental, in the tradition she's a part of, you capitalize truth. If you write the word liberty, you might capitalize it. I don't know. I'll start over. I shouldn't have interrupted her sentence. I got excited about it, I guess. The second volume of Life of the Mind would be devoted to the faculty of the will and, by implication, to the problem of freedom. And freedom, of course, is also capitalized. So, which, as Bergson said, that's Henri Bergson. If you haven't read him, you should read Henri Bergson, as well as some of these other folks here. Amazing, I think in many respects, underrated French philosopher. And she mentions him a lot. As Bergson said, quote, has been to the moderns what the paradoxes of the Eleatics were to the ancients, unquote. And that's E capitalized, L-A-E-L-E-A-T-I-C-S, Eleatics. So she goes on to say the phenomenon we have to deal with are overlaid to an extraordinary extent by a coat of argumentative reasoning, by no means arbitrary, and hence not to be neglected, but which parts company with the actual experiences of the willing ego in favor of doctrines and theories that are not necessarily interested in, quote, saving the phenomena, unquote. That's a phrase term in philosophic literature, saving the phenomenon. I don't want in this present time to unpack that necessarily, but it's referring to, you know, you're going on about your life and you're having these experiences, you know. Here's a good example. Well, maybe it's not a really good example. What comes to my mind, but it looks like the world's flat. I mean, if you have a very limited perception, you know, you're a person, you know, you don't know any science and you're profoundly ignorant, and you look ahead into the horizon looks straight. You see it's a straight line. Well, that's just over there in a very, we say, naive perception. So saving the phenomenon would be sort of, you know, saying, well, your perception's wrong. When you make these assertions, you're just simply wrong. The earth ain't flat, and it looks like a straight line ahead of you, but that's really curves, and our human perception is so, and this is, I would call this a spiritual insight, you know, the limitation, the profound, always thoroughgoing limitation of human perception, that we are not gods and we are not kings and we are not experts, and even if we have a point of view, it's a point of view from here in this one place and not 100 miles this way, and one person's experience, etc. But saving the phenomenon is sort of like saying, you know, but there's something true to our experience. In other words, we may be wrong about the technical accuracy of what vision is doing when we look at a straight ahead. But after all, there is a world there. There is a horizon of some kind, and, you know, it's kind of really there, you know, that kind of thing. I went on for too long about that, but it stuck out at me, or using that phrase. She goes on, one reason for these difficulties is very simple. The faculty of the will was unknown to Greek antiquity and was discovered as a result of experiences about which we hear next to nothing before the first century of the Christian era. And she's going here further ahead in her, like Bernard Williams in Shame and Necessity. You recall I mentioned Bernard Williams' great work on ancients and the moderns and the Aristophanes and Sophocles, Shame and Necessity, in which he talks about how in antiquity, a lot of the ideas that were around and that were in the plays and the works of art that were created are not, according to Williams, entirely dissimilar to our own, and that we're closer to them than we maybe want to admit. And that, you know, and that they had concepts similar to ours. Now, that's an argument Williams is putting forward in that book, and he was partly a classicist, and she's read all the same stuff. She's saying something similar here. She's saying, you know, we hear nothing, and then we hear the Christian comes in. She goes on. The problem for later centuries was to reconcile this faculty with the main tenets of Greek philosophy. Men of thought were no longer willing to abandon philosophy altogether and say, with Paul, it's St. Paul, we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles, unquote, and let it go at that. This, as we shall see, only Paul himself was ever prepared to do. Notice the tone there. She's sort of... If St. Paul wants to do that, that's fine for him kind of thing, but we don't. See, this, in other words, this very quality in Arendt's prose is actually her greatness and her supreme achievement. This attitude. Because what she accomplishes, see, this is a survey. Again, I mean, it's among other things a survey. She's surveying all of this stuff. There was a Greek world, and there were Greek philosophers, and then the Christians come in, and as she gets into the Christians stole so many, or borrowed, or inspired by so many things from these older worlds, these Greek texts, and monks would translate Aristotle and Plato and on and on and right. We have all these the survey quality. But Hannah Arendt, want to reserve the right to, even though I think it's worth making allusions, allusions, references to all these folks, I reserve the right to not follow them in everything and be skeptical, because she's, among other things, a critical thinking person. So that's just one example, and so that often is expressed through tone. And she sets up the major philosophic conflict to such degree to which there was one. Either free will is found to clash with the law of causality, or later, it can hardly be reconciled with the laws of history. She capitalizes H, history, whose meaningfulness depends on progress or a necessary development of the world, capitalized, spirit, that's Hegel, world spirit. These difficulties even persist when all strictly traditional metaphysical or theological interests have withered away. And I'm going to skip some of this a little bit. She quotes John Stuart Mill. She quotes Friedrich Nietzsche. Let's go ahead. The greatest difficulty faced by every discussion of the will is the simple fact that there is no other capacity of the mind whose very existence has been so consistently doubted and refuted by so eminent a series of philosophers. So she's saying in a more beautiful sentence, something that I was saying just earlier, that there's dominant views. And she's saying that if you look at the great philosophers, many of them seem to have a consensus that something like free will is an illusion, or will doesn't even exist in some respects, or etc. Variations on a theme. That's the dominant view now. I mean, for example, you can if you poll scientists, this is very common. This is entirely separate from the correctness or not of the view, right? You could have a dominant, it could be you could live in a world in which there's a consensus in society. Could be anything, it could be the consensus, could be that JFK, we know that JFK, Oswald couldn't have been a crazed, unbalanced communist sympathizer that just hated Jack Kennedy and was anti-American and shot him. Can't be that. We just know it has to be the CIA and the FBI. Because why? Well, we just all know that there's these sort of consensus. So there's a consensus, that the Earth is it's just these kind of things. So there's this consensus, and drum roll, she's a surveyor. The latest is Gilbert Ryle. Now, Gilbert Ryle, the latest of these people to deny will, the latest is Gilbert Ryle, to whom the will is an artificial concept corresponding to nothing that has ever existed and creating useless riddles like so many of the metaphysical fallacies. So Gilbert Ryle, and she's mentioning him because she's sparring with him a little bit. He wrote a text. Now his text on the mind comes out in 1949. And he is most famous, of course, for not only this book, The Concept of Mind, in which he attacks Cartesianism and attacks dualism and tries to inveigh against the dominant view of that time, the late 40s, which is a kind of metaphysics and, religious belief perhaps, and that there's these two substances, the mind and the body, and that it's not just all one thing, and it's, which was the view of not just Anglican vicars at that time, but also philosophy departments in the 40s. And, this rebel, Gilbert Ryle, comes in and gives us the phrase, the ghost in the machine. One of the most famous phrases. Gilbert Ryle, by the way, taught Daniel Dennett, I think. He was friends with Alan Turing, if you know the Turing test. And so there's a very real sense in which the concerns of Gilbert Ryle bring us to 2024 and AI. And what is a mind? And what is a machine? And what is thinking? And what is consciousness? Etc. Anyhow, his book on the mind, she's talking about here. She goes on to say, unaware apparently of his distinguished predecessors, he sets out to refute the doctrine that there exists a faculty of the will. Let's skip over some of this. A little dense. It's wonderful, but it's dense. She gives Ryle some credit. I think she partly agrees with part of him. I'm going to go over here. Again, it's always, that's another thing, complicated thing with Hannah Arendt, is that when she attacks something in somebody, she often says later, well, this person gets this thing right. And that's a kind of interesting thing. So she says here, in what follows, I shall take the internal evidence of an I will as sufficient testimony to the reality of the phenomenon. And since I agree with Ryle and many others that this phenomenon and all the problems connected with it were unknown in Greek antiquity, I must accept what Ryle rejects. So here's where she disagrees with Ryle. Namely, that this faculty was indeed discovered and can be dated. This is part of this thing I've been talking about in all these episodes of concepts in human emotion, experience, life that we take to be natural, that may have developed in humans late in our history, or may not have existed at all for thousands of years, like what Isaiah Berlin does with sincerity. Now, of course, people may say, Isaiah Berlin really says that? Yes, he does. He says that the human societies did not have at least our modern concept of sincerity until the Romantic Revolution. So that people went around life thinking, does it exist or not? Am I pregnant or not, right? Is it true or false? And, Isaiah Berlin, I'm sure, would say that that's why life was often so violent and governments were so oppressive, because credit was never given towards sincerity of what's inside here. Doesn't matter. It's like, you're right or you're not right. And so in a similar way, she's saying that this notion of a will is just, has a date when it appears, I guess. And it's discovered. Not that it doesn't exist. Of course, there was always maybe this will, but that it's discovered, right? And again, I'm not going to give you necessarily my viewpoint here in of these episodes. I'm not going to say, I probably going to be forced to show my hand in some of these things. I do, think there is a lot to the will. And I think there's certain very mysterious senses in which the will could be said to be free. And part of that is connected to my rejection of determinism, or
I guess, what I like to call, I think what Tim Snyder, the historian, calls it this, inevitabilism. That things are just inevitable. And, you know, if something happens on Monday, and that means that a week from Monday, certain things inevitably must follow because of what folks do. Must follow the week after, 100 years after what's done on that Monday. You know, almost like a toothpaste. If you squeeze the toothpaste tube and the toothpaste comes out, that kind of very mechanistic. You know, I don't have any sympathy with that point of view. All the while knowing that that's a dominant view now among many of our public intellectuals and so on. So, where are we here? I lost my place. Skip ahead here for some things. She mentioned some of her favorite people. Friedrich Schiller. She says, thus Schiller declared that there's no other power in man but his will, unquote. And will, as the ground of reality, has power over both reason and sensuality, unquote. Whose opposition, the opposition of two necessities, truth and passion, provides for the origin of freedom. See what Schiller is doing there? Notice the rhapsodic language. That's why he's called a romantic, right? Makes sense, right? And she goes on to discuss Nietzsche. Now, she talks at great length about Nietzsche only because he's, again, one of the few people at this time to defend a kind of a will, I think. But his thing is more power than will, right? So she says, Nietzsche's philosophy, centered on the will to power, seems at first glance to constitute the climax of the will's ascendancy in theoretical reflection. I think this interpretation of Nietzsche is a misunderstanding caused partly by the rather unfortunate circumstances surrounding the first uncritical editions of his posthumously published writings. We owe to Nietzsche a number of decisive insights into the nature of the willing faculty and the willing ego, to which we shall return later. But most of the passages about the will in his work testify to an outspoken hostility toward the theory of the freedom of the will, 100 times refuted, which owes its permanence precisely to its being refutable. Somebody, and this is from Nietzsche, somebody always comes along who feels strong enough to refute it once more. So that's Nietzsche's sense of humor there, kind of saying, you know, there's this thing that we should give up, but someone comes along through their strength and their own will and power of will to say, you know, I'm sorry, we still have free will after all, I guess, and all that. And then she discusses the thought of the eternal return. And on page 22, we get to one of her teachers. Again, so underrated is Karl Jaspers. I can't recommend enough the work of Karl Jaspers. I think the Origin and Goal of History, I think, is great. And some other... He actually did some very odd sort of public intellectual, almost kind of mid-level surveys of Jesus, Socrates, and Buddha. He wrote these little books for the public on them. Really great. She goes on to quote her one of her mentors, Jaspers. For Jaspers, human freedom is guaranteed by our not having the truth. Truth compels, and man can be free only because he does not know the answer to the ultimate questions. Quote, I must will because I do not know. The being is capitalized, being, which is inaccessible to knowledge, can be revealed only to my volition. Not knowing is the root of having to will. Not knowing is the root of having to will. And then she goes to discuss Heidegger, of course, which is inevitable with Arendt as well. Hobbes and Spinoza. Again, another recommendation, Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. Spinoza's Ethics is very good. Baruch Spinoza, the Jewish philosopher, 1600s. These are folks from the 1600s. She goes on to say, Hobbes and Spinoza admit the existence of the will as a subjectively felt faculty and deny only its freedom. So they both say, yeah, it's there, there's a will, but it's just not free. The technical term in today's philosophy for that is called compatibilism, I think. The incompatibilists say that, both are just non-existent. And the compatibilist says, well, we have this, the feeling is wrong, but the thing's going on. It's a little bit like somebody saying to you, oh, I know that you think you had that experience, but that thing you think is nevertheless still a delusion on your part. Kind of a little bit like that. But you do have the feeling. So it's a little that kind of a little trick, I'm caricaturing it to make it a little bit more. I don't want to make it necessarily problematic, but I'm just also having fun with it too. And again, when I praise Thomas Hobbes, I'm praising his political philosophy, his Leviathan, and his very deep work about the problem of Leviathan is really about the problem of evil in society and what to do about it, and the necessity of a state, or necessity of things like a police department, I guess, in a sense, and don't want to get too far afield, but that's what's valuable in Hobbes. Even if Hobbes is, of course, mistaken about many things, as is even, Spinoza's he's a complicated thinker. Spinoza's one of those examples of a person excommunicated or banned for their thinking. In his case, banned by his own his own rabbis, I think, not allowed to. Over and over again, we're going to see, of course, great thinkers banished or banned because of what they write, what they think, what they say, and Spinoza is, of course, one example of that, right? She goes on. Let's get into some Arendt as she puts to rest a little bit temporarily her references and her invoking her own erudition, if I could put it that way. The problem of the new, chapter 4. If we reconsider the objections raised by philosophers against the will, against the faculty's existence, against the notion of human freedom implicit in it, and against the contingency adhering to free will, that is, to an act that by definition can also be left undone, it becomes obvious that they apply much less to what tradition knows as liberum arbitrium, Latin, the freedom of choice between two or more desirable objects or ways of conduct, than to the will as an organ for the future, and identical with the power of beginning something new. The liberum arbitrium decides between things equally possible and given to us, as it were, in statu nascendi, more Latin, as mere potentialities, whereas a power to begin something really new could not very well be preceded by any potentiality, which then would figure as one of the causes of the accomplished act. That's quite a sentence. You have this, well, let's go back. Let's go back. I'm going to talk about style a little bit now. If we consider the objections raised by all these philosophers, and then it becomes obvious that they apply to this, and then the subordinate clauses, right? The freedom of choice between these things, these two things, then to the will, then to this, and it's sort of this sentence. Her constructing a sentence like that is... I'll go on. Let's do another example. Just immediately follows. I had previously mentioned Kant's embarrassment, and quote, in dealing with the power of spontaneously beginning a series of successive things or states, unquote. For instance, if, quote, I at this moment rise from my chair, right? I at this moment arise from my chair. A new series has its absolute beginning in this event, although he adds, as regards time, this event is only the continuation of a preceding series. And this is Arendt now, not Kant. What is so very troublesome is the notion of an absolute beginning. For, back to Kant, quote, a series occurring in the world can have only a relatively first beginning, being always preceded by some other state of things, unquote. And this is, of course, also true for the person of the thinker, inasmuch as I, see what she was doing the prose there? And this is, of course, also true for the person of the thinker, inasmuch as I, who think, never cease to be an appearance among appearances, no matter how successfully I may have withdrawn from them mentally. So she's saying, no matter what I succeed in doing, if I succeed in being a hermit, you know, for example, I'm still going to be an appearance in the fullness of time, in some sense. You know, I can't, kind of thing. It's sort of like you have this series and you can withdraw, and she's back to her old, she starts off this entire book with talking about appearance among appearances. She goes on, that no doubt the very hypothesis of an absolute beginning goes back to the biblical doctrine of creation. She capitalizes creation. There's a visual aspect to this prose as well, with all these capitalized words: freedom, will, creation, right? As distinct from the Oriental theories of emanation, according to which pre-existing forces developed and unfolded into a world. But this doctrine is a sufficient reason in our context only if one adds that God's creation is ex nihilo, and that's a famous Latin phrase for meaning out of nothing, ex nihilo, you know, very something just appearing, you know. Ex nihilo. And of such a creation, the Hebrew Bible knows nothing. It is an addition of later speculations. As Bergson very well knew, there is another side to the matter, Henri Bergson. In the perspective of memory, that is, looked at retrospectively, a freely performed act loses its air of contingency under the impact of now being an accomplished fact, of having become part and parcel of the reality in which we live. The impact of reality is overwhelming. The impact of reality is overwhelming to the point that we are unable to think it away. The act appears to us now in the guise of necessity. A necessity that is by no means a mere delusion of consciousness, or due only to our limited ability to imagine possible alternatives. So she's saying the mind plays a trick on itself. That's an inaccurate way of putting it, but that this thing has been done in the past, so it's natural for us to see it. It had to be that way. It had to, you know, so in the sense of it being inevitable is it in itself a kind of an illusion that is a false idea, because of the very linear sense of time. You have an act, the act is completed, you have another act, it's discrete. And that very flow of things happening in the world, things we're doing, things being done to us, that very setup, as real as it is, and it is real, it's for Arendt, is not an illusion. She's not a Vedantic, she's not a Hindu thinker, who wants to call it all into question, or she's sticking to her tradition, right? She's saying that gives us a sense of, and this is a mistake historians make all the time. They say, well, you see, in 1955, this government did such and such, and you see how, if this happens in 1955, this has got to happen in 1978 because of, and you see, we must develop a law that's how life is, that when I do this thing's going to happen. And you see that all the time. To me, very irritating from both left and right. From all of our historians saying, well, this thing has got to happen because this shares features in common. We're going to use, I don't want to get too polemical or too controversial, but all the time. And Hannah Arendt is saying all of this. Hannah Arendt is wanting to save, in a sense. Well, she's actually in every sentence she writes in this entire book is waving a flag for freedom. She's doing it in her own way, and she's doing it again through the survey of surveying all of these, for her, great thinkers, the Platos and the Aristotles and so on. But she's saying, there's something to freedom. Seen in this perspective of the willing ego, it is not freedom but necessity that appears as a delusion of consciousness. So again, as I was just saying, it's inevitablism that's the illusion, right? Henri Bergson's insight seems to me both elementary and highly significant, but may there not be significance too in the fact that this observation, despite its simple plausibility, never played any role in the endless discussions of necessity versus freedom? That's a question mark. Let's check out that sentence. Bergson's insight seems to me both elementary and highly significant, but may there not be significance too in the fact that this observation, an independent clause is coming here, despite its simple plausibility, comma, never played any role in the endless discussion of necessity versus freedom? And she's getting to one of her favorites here, and mine too, I must say. As far as I know, the point was made only once before Bergson. That was by Duns Scotus. Right? We've encountered him before, the great theologian. The lonely defender of the primacy of the will over the intellect, and more than that, of the factor of contingency in everything that is. So isn't it interesting? One of the greatest Christian theologians ever, Duns Scotus, another worthwhile read, thinks that contingency is a real thing. Right? If there is such a thing as Christian philosophy, then Duns Scotus would have to be recognized not only as the most important thinker of the Christian Middle Ages, but perhaps also as the unique one who did not seek a compromise between the Christian faith and Greek philosophy, and who dared, therefore, to make it a badge of true Christians to say that God acts contingently. That's Scotus' quote. Quote, those who deny that some being is contingent, said Scotus, should be expected to torments until they concede that it is possible for them not to be tormented. Unquote. That's quoting Scotus. New paragraph, new section. Whether contingency for classical philosophy the ultimate in meaninglessness. So she's saying there, whether contingent, we haven't even finished the sentence. Whether contingent, I just want to comment on the word meaninglessness. So she's saying contingency is seen by all these traditional folks as the ultimate in nihilism. So it's sort of a bad, contingency having a bad rap. Although you got Scotus saying contingency is pretty good. It has this bad reputation, bad rap, you know? Because the classical cats think it's a problem, you know? Because a lot of those classical cats have a clockwork view of the world. Everything's set up and we just play a role in it and end of discussion. Let's get on with things. Like we get up, drink our coffee and kind of... Hannah Arendt's coming out of this different tradition. Hannah Arendt has no patience for that kind of devotion to common sense and getting on with things. Couldn't be less interested. In part, I suspect because it disables her from writing sentences like she just wrote that we were talking about with the subordinate clauses. In other words, if you're going to do me out of a gig of being able to write a sentence like that, Mitch Hampton all these years later in 2024 could sit down with all of us and say, look at this subordinate clause and look, if I can't do that, if you want to make prose into a mere specimen of natural science only, then sorry, don't do me out of a gig. I want to be able to show off my chops, kind of in a way she's saying, I think, some extent. Let's finish this sentence. Their contingency for classical philosophy, the ultimate in meaninglessness, burst as a reality upon the early centuries of the Common Era because of biblical doctrine, which pitted contingency against necessity, particularity against universality, will against intellect, thus securing a place for the contingent within philosophy against the latter's original bias, or, there's more to this sentence, or whether the shattering political experiences of these early centuries had forced wide open the truisms and plausibilities of ancient thinking may be open to doubt. What is not open to doubt is that the original bias against contingency, particularity, and will, and the predominance accorded to necessity, universality, and intellect, survive the challenge deep into the modern age. Religious and medieval, as well as secular and modern philosophy, found many different ways of assimilating the will, the organ of freedom, and the future to the older order of things. For however we may look at these matters, factually Bergson is quite right when he asserts, quote, most philosophers are unable to conceive of radical novelty and unpredictability. Even those very few who believed in the liberal arbitrium have reduced it to a simple choice. Puts that in scare quotes, choice, between two or several options, as though these options were possibilities, and the will was restricted to realizing but one of them. Hence, they still admitted that everything is given. They seem never to have had the slightest notion of an entirely new activity. And such an activity is, after all, free action. Unquote. Just quoting Bergson there. No doubt even today, if we listen to a dispute between two philosophers, this is Arendt, if we listen today to a dispute between two philosophers, one of whom argues for determinism and the other for freedom, it will always be the determinist who appears to be right. The audience will always agree that he is simple, clear, and true, unquote. Which is probably why today my feed is filled with the Sam Harris's of the world and Robert Sapolsky's, the scientist of the world. And, I'm just naming examples of determinists. Dan Dennett's, who just rest in me, rest in peace. That is something about, she's saying that there's, Bergson and Hannah Arendt is saying, they just kind of have this, what's the word? Well, maybe it's a kind of a privilege, but I don't mean that word the way political philosophers use the word. I just mean it seems to be apparently more convincing. How about that? Yeah, there's an appearance of it being more convincing on the world stage, in the public stage, in public forums, etc. Which has, as we all know, has absolutely nothing to do whatsoever with whether in fact it is true. Okay. The whole poem has haunted philosophers. Notice her choice of words, haunted. Philosophers are haunted by this problem. As you know, free will determinism is not the only ghostly, spectral entity to haunt philosophers, but also mind and body is another one. The mind-body question is another spectral haunting. Right? There's many. The whole problem is haunted philosophers, and their attempts at solving it have never been very successful. As a rule, their arguments evade the issue in its stark simplicity. Evil. Hannah Arendt always comes back to evil eventually, doesn't she, in her text? She's evil is either denied true reality, it exists only as a deficient mode of the good. Now that's a reference to a common early theology. It's defining evil as the absence of good, right? Sort of like the cliche, evil prospers because good people do not act, and so on, or quite. That's a version of that. Or it's sort of a negative energy. It's sort of like the absence of a thing, which I suspect is maybe connected to the metaphysical doctrine, which, by the way, I personally reject. I don't agree with it. The metaphysical doctrine that evil is a kind of an illusion we undergo because we haven't seen the light. That it's something. It's like a kind of it's kind of a primitive version of something that's more true, more good, more developed. Kind of a little bit like immaturity. I mean, that's a common view. I happen to reject that view, but that's an example that I think. Just trying to think out here examples. Or evil's explained away as a kind of optical illusion. I just said that. The fault is with our limited intellect, which fails to fit some particular properly into the encompassing whole that would justify it. All this on the unguarded assumption that only the whole is actually real. In the words of Hegel, evil, not unlike freedom, seems to belong to those about which the most learned and ingenious men can know almost nothing. If one looks, and then there's another chapter 5 here. It's called The Clash Between Thinking and Willing. The tonality of mental activities. That's how she titles her chapter. Let's go over that again. The clash between thinking and willing. So thinking and willing for her, the two big parts of the mind, are themselves. There's a clash between them, I guess she's saying in the very title. And then colon, the tonality of mental activity. So she's using this word tonality from music, I guess. It's interesting, right? I like that. From her chapter title. She starts. If one looks at this record with eyes unclouded by theories and traditions, religious or secular, it is certainly hard to escape the conclusion that philosophers seem genetically unable to come to terms with certain phenomena of the mind and its position in the world. And we can no more trust men of thought to arrive at a fair estimate of the will than we could ever trust them to arrive at a fair estimate of the body. See the tone there? It's kind of like we can't trust these folks. Men of thought can't be trusted. I mean, she's holding back a little bit. So there's all kinds of rhetorical. I don't know off the top of my head. I used to have memorized all of the rhetorical figures of speech. Of understatement, overstatement, and all this stuff. And that would be a whole other episode or another series, But she's utilizing all of that there, all of under the rubric of MaryMcCarthy's admonishment. Well, she doesn't admonish Hannah Arendt. I don't even think in these letters, they'll be careful of her tone. And with the very outset of this episode, I said, it's the thing that makes Hannah Arendt Hannah Arendt. Thank God she doesn't write like Rabbi Harold Kushner, or write like Norman Cousins. Thank God that she writes like herself. And thank God she doesn't write like Annie Dillard. We're not, human beings are themselves. And I say that, I'm just trying to pick out a point of contrast. If we decided we're gonna throw this book down and I'm canceled Hannah Arendt's Life of the Mind. We're just gonna read An American Childhood by Annie Dillard. One of the greatest works of prose in the past 50 years, easily. If I said that now, it would not be a waste of our time. That's how good Annie Dillard actually is. But I'm just saying that Hannah Arendt's got to be Hannah Arendt, not somebody else. And we go to a text, or we go to a poem, a piece of music, for it to be what it is. So I'm not going to, at least in present circumstances, ask it to be, a ballad. A ballad has to be a ballad and not an up-tempo tune. A waltz is in 3, not in 4. That's why it's a waltz. It's a 3/4, not 4/4, not quarter time. And Hannah Arendt is sort of, the wisdom of Arendt is precisely in her tone, in how she looked at Eichmann in that trial, and stared at him and thought about. And she's somebody that at the age of 12, 13, 14, 15 was organizing Jews to escape immense suffering, and having discussions with Karl Jaspers about the meaning of life. Can you imagine being 16, 17, 18 and studying with a Karl Jaspers and talking about such things? I mean, can you imagine? We'll talk about, we should all be so fortunate, actually. And all that goes into making her who she is. I sort of allow myself to develop a little bit of a polemical rant. Little bit, not too much. Just felt moved to do so. I mean, we're going to continue this book. We're going to finish out. We're not going to get to judging because she never got to judging. She never wrote it. So we're going to stop with, when we finish this volume, and we're going to do it. So I promise I'm not going to start reading Annie Dillard. But we could. I mean, we could, right? And if we were to switch like that and switch gears and horses in midstream, we'd have to enter the world of this different author. And that would be interesting, right? I guess. If we are so moved to do so. So. Here. We're in a section now called Body and Soul and Soul and Mind. And I'm going to go to chapter 4, Body and Soul, Soul and Mind. And this is kind of, I want to say before we launch into her chapter 4 here of this. This is a section, chapter 4 of. This is all under the appearance, the number 1, section 1, appearance, body, and soul, and so on mind. I should say that all of this is sort of her exploring and surveying. Okay. Besides, the difficulties are far from being merely terminological. That is, it's not just a semantic thing. It's deeper. Besides, the difficulties are far from being merely terminological. They are intimately related to the problematic beliefs we hold with regard to our psychic life and the relationship of soul and body. To be sure, we are inclined to agree that no bodily inside ever appears authentically of its own accord, and no bodily inside ever appears authentically of its own accord. But if we speak of an inner life that is expressed in outward appearance, we mean the life of the soul. The inside-outside relation true for our bodies is not true for our souls, even though we speak of our psychic life and its location inside ourselves in metaphors obviously drawn from bodily data and experiences. The same use of metaphors, moreover, is characteristic of our conceptual language, designed to make manifest the life of the mind. The words we use in strictly philosophical discourse are also invariably derived from expressions originally related to the world as given to our 5 bodily senses, from whose experience they then, as Locke pointed out, are carried over to, she's going to quote Locke as she does everybody else, more abstruse significations, and made to stand for ideas that come not under the cognizance of our senses, unquote. Only by means of such transfers could men conceive those operations they experimented in themselves, which made no outward sensible appearances. Locke relies here on the old tacit assumption of identity of soul and mind, both being opposed to the body by virtue of their invisibility. Upon closer examination, however, it turns out that what is true for the mind, namely that metaphorical language, is the only way. She's saying upon closer examination, we're going to look closer, there's this metaphorical language. She goes to say it's the only way it has to make an outward sensible appearance. Even silent, non-appearing activity already consists in speech, the soundless dialogue of me with myself is not at all true for the life of the soul. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. What becomes manifest when we speak about psychic experiences is never the experience itself, but whatever we think is italicized, about it when we reflect upon it. Unlike thoughts and ideas, feelings, passions, and emotions can no more become part and parcel of the world of appearances than can our inner organs. What appears in the outside world, in addition to physical signs, is only what we make of them through the operation of thought. Every show of anger, as distinct from the anger I already feel, already contains a reflection on it. And it is this reflection that gives the emotion the highly individualized form which is meaningful for all surface phenomena. So she's saying that things are always cooked and prepared. They're never raw or immediate, I think. She's saying that these things that we want to accord secondary consideration, like creating one of her complex sentences with its subordinate clauses and so on, that's always happening. Right? She's trying to get us to move away. She's trying to get us to move away from, I think for her, a very, you could call it Anglophone, we could call it English, we could say, picture of the world in which things happen to me and I respond to them. I'm stimulated and then I act. There's a wonderful philosopher whose name escapes me, a French philosopher. I'm going to actually close with this because it's so interesting. Who was a theorist of attention. And he's a continental cat because he was French. And he just passed recently, I think. And he wrote this long text on attention, in partly as a critique of the prevailing definitions of attention that are dominant now. And I think he suggests in that text that a synonym for attention is waiting. That to pay attention is to be in a state of waiting. Completely opposite of what the mechanistic stimulus response behavioral scientists would tell you, that attention is just you're getting distracted here. No, it's actually waiting. Waiting to see something unfold over time, over deep durational time. That's what attention really is. What would it look like for us to define attention as related to states of waiting? Isn't that interesting? That's kind of the milieu we're in now, very similar to what Arendt is doing in this text. She goes on to show one's anger is one form of self-presentation. I decide what is fit for appearance. In other words, the person angry is making a decision. It's a decision that's been, let's concede the traditional, let's concede the traditional point of view. Yes, it could be conditioned. Yes, it's a habit. Yes, it seems inevitable. It seems like a reaction that's triggered by something. It's all that. We'll concede that, but goes on here. It's not that simple. In other words, the emotions I feel are no more meant to be shown in their unadulterated state than the inner organs by which we live. So she's saying the notion that a dude has to do certain things and act upon what he feels, for Hannah Arendt would be as absurd as to say that we need to look at people's hearts and livers and pancreas as they walk around. I think it's very strong. I don't want to say it's hyperbole, but she's making the strongest point there. And in turn, reorient all of our assumptions about what it is to be in the world. That's in a very real sense why Hannah Arendt was comfortable with, when she writes that statement about Adolf Eichmann, she says, yes, you should be killed by the government of Israel, if only because you refuse to share the world with us. And since you refuse to share the world with us, it's sort of like We're inhabiting a world of her consciousness. And at least for the sake of these episodes, to the degree that we're going to discuss her life of the mind, we got to meet Hannah Arendt halfway at the very least. You know? I may put on a different hat. You know, if we did another kind of episode about somebody else, like an Annie Dillard or like a Oscar Peterson, the pianist, we can listen to Oscar Peterson solo. We're gonna change clothes, you know, a little bit, and we're gonna deal with very different considerations of, you know, fast bebop lines on the piano. You know, we're gonna have to enter that, meet that halfway. You know, if we were gonna do that. If we were going to do, you know, so it's always, you know, we're always in these episodes taking on the thoughts of a thinker. And I must confess, too, that my emphasis is always on entering into what she wrote and accomplished, and leaving to the side, consciously leaving to the side considerations that would prevent or disable us from entering into Hannah Arendt. So in a sense, certain sense in these episodes, I'm embracing her tone to the degree to which I can, and embracing her grammatical constructions, and above all, her syntax. So, I'm going to cut to chapter 5, appearance of semblance, and have one of her. She uses the word semblance, semblance, semblance. That. Notice how she starts paragraphs with besides, comma, that such and such. That's common to her style. She does that over and over again. That natural and inevitable semblances are inherent in a world of appearances from which we can never escape is perhaps the strongest and certainly the most plausible argument against the single-minded positivism that believes it has found a firm ground of certainty if it only excludes all mental phenomena from considerations and holds fast to observable facts, the everyday reality given to our senses. So she's positivism. So someone like a Gilbert Ryle, for example, or an Alan Turing, a little bit. Not that we want to just label them positivists or behaviorists necessarily, but it's kind of she's saying this simple-minded point of view. And what is that simple-minded point of view? What does a positivist think? Believes it has found a firm ground of certainty if it only excludes all mental phenomena from consideration. So we got to set up an artificial scenario in the laboratory, and we got to have to exclude. What do we exclude? Exclude thought, exclude mind. In short, exclude all the interesting stuff. I would say all the good stuff, if you want to put it that way, in order to create a replicable, repeatable model. And I should say all of us today are under the assumptions of such a worldview. A worldview that actually in of itself did bring us AI actually, if we want to put it in the most strongest sense. Okay. Arendt's having none of it. She's not No patience with it. She goes on to say, all living creatures capable both of receiving appearance through sense organs and displaying themselves as appearances, that they're strutting their stuff. She's saying living creatures are always strutting their stuff. They're on the world stage. And you got to take into account their strut, if you want to put it that way, I could put it that way. They're strutting their stuff. Displaying themselves as appearances. All these living creatures are subject to authentic illusions, which are by no means the same for each species. But connected with the form and mode of their specific life process. So she's saying that even every species has their own illusion, I guess, unique to their history and their experience, right? I'm going to sort of stop at chapter 6. Now, see, because she's going to talk about Kant, and she's going to talk about the thinking ego and the self, and I should emphasize that when Hannah Arendt uses the phrase thinking ego, she's discussing something as neutral as discussing the heart or discussing freedom. It's sort of a faculty. She does not mean, when she uses the word ego, anything pejorative whatsoever. The way popular culture often uses it, like, the ego, like something to be gotten rid of. It's like a faculty that's always there, in a sense, I think. And so I'm going to stop there, and so in the episode 5, we're gonna pick up with Kant. She was in the midst of doing lectures on Immanuel Kant. And I think we have to take into account her, to some extent, her interest in Kant, her lectures on Kant at the same time period. I mean, if I randomly, I'm just going through these pages, and we just take, so for example, this is in the Reality and Thinking Ego section. At the bottom of the page 50, she says, to each of our 5 senses corresponds a specific, sensorially perceptible property of the world. I'm going to repeat that sentence. I maintain there's this aesthetic dimension to her prose. To each of our 5 senses corresponds a specific, sensorially perceptible property of the world. Well, that's a sentence. That's a way to describe what the 5 senses do. How different is that from a text which says we have hearing, we have speech, we have eyes, and each of these, each of these senses, she could have just said correspond to something in daily life. She ain't gonna make it that boring. She goes on, our world is visible because we have vision, audible because we have hearing, touchable and full of odors and tastes because we have touch, smell, and taste. The 6 senses corresponding worldly property. She doesn't say the 6th sense property. She says the 6 senses corresponding worldly property is realness. That's italicized, is realness. Sense of the real, right? And the difficulty with this property is that it cannot be perceived like other sensory properties. So she's saying that the real can't be perceived like a table or a chair or, dare I say, even like this, I don't know, this very podcast episode. Or the buzz of that cell phone going off, which I maybe should have turned off or not turned on. Or that it's 1:20 now and that we're approaching 90 minutes. Or that I'm wearing a tan suit that's in the Brown family that has red in it. Or that it's of Solero cloth, or that I'm taking off my glasses now. But you know, all these things, they're real. But you know, there are these things that are nevertheless set apart from that list of items, to the degree to which we want to concede that they are real and that that's what we're doing. So that's the conclusion of our episode 4 of Life of the Mind, and we're going to pick up with Kant next time we meet. And, you know, I might continue the discussion of the thinking ego, and here, science and common sense. And so I've enjoyed this. It's an honor to discuss this book. And I hope you have a great weekend. And there's an episode coming up soon with an architect, I think, Michael Meerschaert, and other things coming up too. So thank you. Journey of an Aesthete podcast.